It is my pleasure today to moderate this panel on the Supreme Court and sort of contemporary issues around critical race theory and confirmation hearings. And we will have two papers. The first will be presented by Laurie Rice and Stephen Bryan. Dr. Rice is a professor of political science from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Her research interests include political communication, the presidency, elections, social media, and civic engagement. She is co-author of the following books: The Political Voices of Generation Z, Web 2.0 and Political Mobilization of College Students, and co-editor of The American Political Parties Under Pressure. Her work also appears in various journals, including Presidential Studies Quarterly, Social Science Computer Review, and the Journal of Information Technology and Politics. She provides expertise on elections, social media, and the presidency to regional, national, and international media, and has written pieces for The Hill, The Huffington Post, and the St. Louis Dispatch. Co-presenting with Dr. Rice is one of her students, Stephen Bryan. Stephen is an undergraduate student at Southern Illinois Edwardsville, pursuing an interdisciplinary degree in geography and political science. He is interested in studying the interactions of media, politics, and public opinion. Prior to attending Southern Illinois Edwardsville, Stephen received a BFA in printmaking from Washington University in St. Louis, and has since worked with technology and data engineering in the advertising industry. They will present first, and then followed by Julia Valdes. Dr. Valdes is an Indianapolis native who received her PhD in political science from Northwestern University in 2017. She attended University of Indiana for her undergraduate education, where she was a McNair Scholar. She currently works at Indiana State University in Terre Haute. Dr. Valdes studies political communication, public opinion, and political consumerism. Two of her latest projects include examining the effects of occupational licensing on job opportunities for formerly incarcerated individuals, and studying the responses of legislators to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Her dad and grandparents are immigrants from Cuba in the 1960s, immigrated from Cuba in the 1960s. She's particularly interested in the history and policies of the post office, thanks to stories told by her mother while working there. Is that right? In her spare time, Dr. Valdes likes to scrapbook and paint. Anyway, two very interesting papers that are interconnected. We'll have both presentations and then have time for questions from there. And I will yield the floor to Dr. Rice.
So the research that we're presenting today looks at the sudden rise of critical race theory as a line of inquiry in Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and provides an exploration of the changing rhetoric on race in the televised era. In some respects, Justice Jackson's confirmation hearing resembled the typical confirmation hearing as the literature on Supreme Court confirmation hearings would suggest, because they start with a presumption of success, and yet hearings have become highly contentious affairs. So there might be, in many cases, a foregone conclusion, but there's quite a bit of controversy before we get there. Opponents to nominees often try to link that nominee to controversy and then use those committee hearings as well as the mass media to spread that controversy to the public. And frequent opposition contentions have included, according to Gibson and Caldera, that the nominee is prejudiced, is associated with biased or extremist groups, is dogmatic, or is outside the broad ideological consensus in the country. One of the things that made Justice Jackson's confirmation different, though, was the emergence of critical race theory. And so let's take a listen to one of those first instances where it was raised.
You once wrote that every judge has, and I quote, personal hidden agendas, end quote, that influence how they decide cases. So I can only wonder, what's your hidden agenda? Is it to let violent criminals, cop killers, and child predators back to the streets? Is it to restrict parental rights and expand government's reach into our schools and our private family decisions? Is it to support the radical left's attempt to pack the Supreme Court? You have praised the 1619 Project, which argues the U.S. is a fundamentally racist country, and you have made clear that you believe judges must consider critical race theory when deciding how to sentence criminal defendants. Is it your personal hidden agenda to incorporate critical race theory into our legal system?
Well, we'll unpack that quote a little bit more as we go. But for the moment, I just want to draw your attention to that question about critical race theory. Research questions that we explore in our work: why did critical race theory, with roots going back more than 4 decades, not emerge as a subject of discussion in confirmation hearings until 2022? In addition, what influenced the content of this discussion? We look at both the field of law and television coverage. And we focus in particular on the role of television and the incentive that it provides senators to tailor their statements and questions with an eye towards enhanced media coverage. But that incentive varies based on the decision of those television channels, which we'll get to. We also explore how did discussions of race differ between Justice Jackson's confirmation hearing and prior confirmation hearings in the televised era. But let's do a little bit of historical context first and look at a brief history of confirmation hearings. So the Senate Judiciary Committee itself didn't form until 1816, so our earliest Supreme Court justices did not go through confirmation hearings. And it wasn't until 1873, in fact, that they held the first hearing for a Supreme Court nominee. And in those early years, hearings were relatively rare, so up until the 1920s, only about 10% of Supreme Court nominees had hearings. And most of those hearings happened behind closed doors. But movements towards transparency often intersected with topics related to race. So in 1937, when Hugo Black was nominated to the Supreme Court and readily confirmed by the Senate, there was public outcry, journalistic investigations, and outcry by the American Bar Association because he had once been a member, a lifetime member, in fact, of the KKK. And the ABA pushed for the Senate to open up their proceedings so that the public could know whether or not nominees were receiving adequate scrutiny for their views. And so in 1939, public hearings became the norm, but nominee testimony was still rare. That changed after the landmark decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. The next Supreme Court justice to be nominated after that, John Harlan, was the first to have mandatory testimony, and we've seen nominees testify ever since at their confirmation hearings. And Southern senators, in fact, used those hearings to engage in explicit position taking against the Brown decision. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall became our nation's first Black Supreme Court justice. Now, he was a highly qualified individual who had in fact argued 32 cases before the Supreme Court with more than a 90% success rate. Most Supreme Court justices could not claim such a thing. And yet, Southern senators went on the offensive. And while they claimed that their attacks had nothing to do with race, it was very clear that they were trying to block Thurgood Marshall from being on the court. And in fact, Strom Thurmond used this strategy of obscure questions. And many senators, who were also lawyers in the room, were speaking up saying, we have no idea what the answer to these questions are. But Thurgood Marshall was expected to just sit there and listen and quietly not react. And then in 1969 and 1970, we saw 2 nominees to the Supreme Court with troubling views on race, both Haynesworth and Carswell. And while they were both rejected, 45 individuals voted yes for both of them. And keep in mind, troubling views on race were not the only issue with their nominations. Both of them had very serious ethical concerns raised against them. In short, While race has helped open up the confirmation hearings, the Senate does not have a very good track record. So now let's bring in the role of television. It was in 1981 that confirmation hearings started being televised. This offers senators the opportunity to score political points with their base and engage in position taking. But incentives to perform for the camera at hearings are shaped by broadcasting decisions. Some stations, like C-SPAN, offer their viewers live complete coverage. Others choose a mix of mediated and live coverage, and still others choose fully mediated coverage. And fully mediated coverage, senators have to compete for a limited set of sound bites, and they often do so by offering more and more inflammatory sorts of rhetoric. So I'm now going to turn things over to Stephen, who's going to introduce our data and methods.
So does this work? Good. All right. So we really wanted to look at, we used 3 different data sources, the first being the C-SPAN API. And we really looked at 2 topics when it came to the data that we collected. The first being mentions of race in Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and the second being mentions of critical race theory in Supreme Court hearings. And all of this came from the C-SPAN API. Next we used JSTOR to find mentions of critical race theory in gatekeeping law journals, just to compare with what we were seeing in the Supreme Court hearings. And we used the GDELT Television Explorer tool to collect mentions of critical race theory on Fox News from 2009 to 2022. And also to take a look at coverage of Republican senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee before and after the hearings. So what we did was, first we programmatically collected all of every mention we could find from each of these data sources of the topics at hand, and pulled them into a tabular data set. Once we had them in a data set, we performed some basic natural language processing cleaning to those data sets. So removing things like stop words, therefore, words like that, standard practice, and getting them ready for analysis. We really did 2 types of analysis on the data. The first was we calculated trigrams, frequency of just 3-word phrases, so 3 words that appeared consecutively next to each other. The other bit of data analysis that we did was we calculated collocations. Collocations were also 3-word collocations, but they did not consider intervening words. So what we did was we took a moving window of 10 words and considered 3-word groupings that happened within that moving window according to a likelihood ratio score, which is basically a score of the probability of words occurring together within that window versus probability of words occurring separately in that window. But the first thing we did was just look at the quantity of mentions, specifically in hearings. So this is just a raw count of mentions of race in each hearing, separated, using the program title from the C-SPAN API. We found that Thomas had the most mentions by far, accounted for 30. Let's see. Clarence Thomas's hearing had the most mentions, with the Bork hearings coming in second. The Bork hearings were specifically, he had written an article stating, or arguing that while racial discrimination is abhorrent, it shouldn't be outlawed by Congress because it would be a loss of vital personal liberty. So that accounts for sort of the increased scrutiny and the number of mentions that happened there. But aside from Thomas, there really were not the kind of numbers in terms of mentions of race across the other hearings. Especially the thing that we considered was that the Jackson hearing was just about the median of number of mentions of race, despite the fact that she was the first Black woman nominated and confirmed to the court. The second thing we did was really try to understand the substance of the mentions of race across the hearings. So to understand the context, what they were talking about when they talked about race. From this perspective, we considered common trigrams associated with the mentions of race during the Jackson hearings, and then compared those to the mentions of race, the common trigrams used in the mentions of race in all other hearings. And you'll see that in all other hearings, phrases like Equal Protection Clause, Civil Rights Act, Board, Brown Board of Education, things that had to do with how the nominee may rule on issues of race were quite present in all the other hearings. Meanwhile, in Jackson's hearings, there really was a overwhelming focus on critical race theory. That is the phrase that occurred the most, by far. There's a few mentions to her, relating to her nomination as the first black woman to the court, but overwhelmingly it was about critical race theory. When we compared co-locations in the Jackson hearing, they basically confirmed what we saw when we just did raw frequency counts of 3-word phrases. But what we did with co-locations was compare just the number of mentions of specific co-locations between the different hearings. So in all other hearings aside from Jackson, the Equal Protection Clause was the most likely co-location that we found. Whereas in Jackson's hearing, it was critical race theory. In all the other hearings, critical race theory couldn't even be found according to a likelihood ratio at all in a 10-word window. So it just didn't exist. Meanwhile, in Jackson hearings, anything with phrases with the words race and theory in it happened quite a lot. In fact, anywhere from 16 to 81 times the rate that those words occurred in all other hearings. Finally, we compared mentions of race from the Thomas confirmation hearings with the Jackson confirmation hearings. And this basically says, indicates what the other ones indicated. That Thomas, there was a focus on how he would rule on specific issues, dealing with race. In the Jackson confirmation hearing, obviously, they just talked about critical race theory. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over back to Dr. Rice.
So we're interested in where does this focus on critical race theory come from. Critical race theory, of course, began as a legal theory emerging out of the field of critical legal studies, and so it would seem a natural place to discuss critical race theory might be Supreme Court confirmation hearings. But Ketanji Brown Jackson herself had only mentioned it once in a speech prior to the confirmation hearings, where she listed it as one of a multitude of factors that people might consider when determining sentencing policy. So it doesn't seem likely that Jackson herself, at least her past work, is the impetus for this. Critical race theory, of course, is grounded in the work of Derek Bell. The first CRT workshop was held in 1989 with a variety of legal scholars in attendance, and CRT as it emerged was met with a range of responses from law schools. While some were welcoming, others were downright hostile. So we decided to trace the emergence of critical race theory in gatekeeper law journals. Gatekeeper law journals we define as those from the nation's most elite law schools that have a disproportionate share of Supreme Court justices, law clerks, and US senators, as we think those might be the most influential in terms of senators' lines of questioning were law to be influencing discussion of critical race theory. So if we look at number of mentions in these gatekeeper law journals over time, the pattern that we see here does not suggest that they were the impetus for the discussions in the Jackson hearings, because the number of mentions in these law journals was declining over time. If senators were responding to the field of law, you would instead expect critical race theory to start to show up in hearings in the mid-90s or early 2000s, perhaps. If we look instead at television and mentions of critical race theory, you see a very different story. So while there are a few mentions over time on C-SPAN, which we will come back to, dating back to 1995, the vast majority of coverage, whether we're talking about C-SPAN or Fox News, happens after 2019, and in fact, especially in the year 2021. And just for some context, if we standardize our units here, Fox News in those years devoted far more attention to critical race theory than did C-SPAN. So the timing of the emergence so far is much more consistent with television trends than with trends seen in gatekeeper law journals. Now let's look a moment at content. So we broke down by decade the most common trigrams in close conjunction with critical race theory in these gatekeeper law journals. And we see some of those same themes that were discussed in hearings aside from Jackson's, like equal protection clause, Brown versus Board of Education, affirmative action, things like that. You also see in the 1990s a lot of attention to intersectional identities. As we move into the 2010s and the beginning of the 2020s, we still see an emphasis on equal protection clause, but we start to see the emergence of concepts such as marginal whiteness framework and things like that. Now, if we look at the substance of critical race theory on C-SPAN, C-SPAN is interesting in that we found an early mention in 1995 where they broadcast a law conference, and it offered their viewers an opportunity to learn about critical race theory from a recent article that had recently been published in the California Law Review. And in fact, if you look at the trigrams of mentions of critical race theory in the 1990s and 2000s, you see lots of mentions of specific law schools or law journals. So much more attention to actually critical race theory as used in the field of law. Well, of course, attention grows a little bit in the 2010s and explodes in the early 2020s. You still see some emphasis on some of those familiar themes, like the Equal Rights Amendment, for example. But in the 2020s, we also see the emergence of Black Lives Matter. But of course, none of that rhetoric makes it into the discussion of critical race theory in Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation hearings. If we look at what we see on Fox News, first of all, we only show overall trigrams because 99.5% of the mentions on Fox News happened after 2019. Although we did find a few early references on Glenn Beck's show back in 2010. Now, of course, most of the discussion of critical race theory is highly negative on Fox News. And if you look at the most common trigrams, every single one of them has to do with school. So viewers of Fox News wouldn't necessarily be thinking that the Supreme Court confirmation is an obvious place to discuss this. Where they would see critical race theory as relevant is in our nation's schools. So if we put that Fox News trigram side by side with common mentions of race during Justice Jackson's confirmation, we start to see some common themes. So notice about midway through that list of trigrams for Justice Jackson, you see school, private school, public school. So here we see some evidence that it's responsive more to that rhetoric on Fox News than anything else. Then if we drill down a little bit further and look at not mentions of race, but trigrams for mentions specifically of critical race theory during Jackson's hearing, we see some additional interesting trends emerge. So the most common mention was law school note. This actually referred to not something about critical race theory, but to a note that she had written about sentencing guidelines for those convicted of child pornography. And in fact, you'll also see down in the middle of the list several references to that: child pornography offender pedophiles, and so forth. What this tells us is that in the same breath that many senators brought up critical race theory, they also talked about sentencing for those who had used child pornography. But that's not the only thing. So we also see Georgetown Day School, the school that Justice Jackson's children attended, and Senator Cruz brought that up and talked about that in close conjunction with critical race theory. And what he was essentially doing was making critical race theory and education, making that link and trying to make it appropriate to the confirmation hearings. And then we also see allow biological male, which was references to transgender rights. That was also brought up often in the same breath as critical race theory. So what we're basically seeing is senators focusing on lightning rod conservative issues. So we were interested in how much did they get rewarded for that. So we looked at how much media attention did Republican Senate Judiciary members receive in the 2 weeks prior to the hearings and in the 2-week period between when the hearings started and the confirmation vote. Now, first of all, Lindsey Graham is just a really good media entrepreneur, so he gets lots of media attention, and his attention actually went down during the hearings because he was not one of the ones that really focused on a lot of inflammatory rhetoric. Chuck Grassley, a ranking Republican member of the committee, had an astronomical increase in the amount of attention, but again, he wasn't one who really stood out in terms of his rhetoric. The people who did were people like Senator Blackburn, that we saw the quote from at the beginning. And she tied critical race theory, child pornography sentencing, and transgender rights all together multiple times throughout the hearings. And we can see that her coverage jumped up as a result. Ted Cruz managed to successfully increase by tying critical race theory to schools. But we also saw increases by Josh Hawley, who focused it on child pornography sentencing. And then we also looked at the differences in mentions of these senators on Fox News versus C-SPAN. So C-SPAN, because they show the complete coverage, gives us an idea of how much these senators talked during the confirmation hearings. So if we look at the blue line for Fox News in reference to that, what we're looking for are those where it's much disproportionately higher in Fox News than C-SPAN. And you can really see how some senators were disproportionately rewarded with airtime for using inflammatory rhetoric. So Marsha Blackburn managed to get a lot of attention by bringing up these topics together. Cotton focused on a little bit critical race theory, but a lot about sentencing on crime. Talked a lot about law and order issues, which are typically racially coded, and saw a lot of attention as a result. And Ted Cruz, by tying critical race theory to schools, which Republican viewers were used to hearing, Fox News viewers were used to hearing, was also rewarded as a result. So conclusions. The evidence suggests that television coverage and not developments within the field of law drove the sudden emergence of critical race theory. So do comparisons of content. They show that particularly television through Fox News was driving how critical race theory was talked about during Justice Jackson's confirmation hearing. We also found that C-SPAN coverage of critical race theory had a lot more similarity to how critical race theory is discussed in the field of law, and also to prior confirmation hearings, than what we see for Fox News. And that Republican members of the Judiciary Committee who mentioned critical race theory, especially if they did it in conjunction with other lightning rod issues for conservatives, were particularly effective at drawing airtime on Fox News. So some implications. Our findings are consistent with prior research that female nominees get questioned more about their judicial philosophy than their male counterparts, except it was not clear at all that critical race theory was actually part of Justice Jackson's judicial philosophy. And it's also consistent with work that shows that female members of racial minority groups may face even more scrutiny, especially by senators of the opposite political party as the president nominating them. Now, nominees to the Supreme Court have long been coached not to engage with the attacks launched against them. So if you recall back in that clip that we watched, as those charges were being levied against Justice Jackson, she sat there showing no emotion, not reacting at all, because that's what justices, or people who want to be justices, are coached to do. But we need to think about the impact of that. Because if they vigorously defend themselves, then they get accused of not possessing the proper temperament for a judge. And this can be particularly damaging for female nominees and for members of racial and ethnic minorities, because it forces these nominees to experience what's sometimes thinly veiled or even overt sexism and racism from those who somehow see them as less qualified to serve on the bench because of these characteristics. And Boyd et al. Warn that this serves to perpetuate negative stereotypes, that male judges are more believably prepared to serve in the judiciary, and specifically as Supreme Court justices. And they caution that as more and more female and minority nominees participate in the confirmation process, this differential treatment could cast the legitimacy of the process and the court itself into doubt. So future research should investigate how these attacks affect the public confidence in Supreme Court justices, as well as how discussions of race in confirmation hearings actually shape viewers' understanding and opinions about race and the law. Now, many have called for reforms to the Supreme Court confirmation process. And there's been quite a bit of focus on the problem of vague answers from Supreme Court nominees. But there perhaps should be more focus on senators' efforts to get attention. And we need to keep in mind that when airtime is freely available and the complete hearings are broadcast and viewed, that senators actually have reduced enticements to use incendiary questioning to secure airtime, because every member who speaks automatically gets it. But selective and highly mediated coverage of Supreme Court confirmation hearings not only encourages senators to outcompete each other for that limited television time, but it also provides the audience a skewed view of the nominee.
Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I have several questions I want to come back to, and hopefully I won't dominate the conversation. I'll do my best not to do that, but a very interesting presentation. Dr. Valdes is next.
Alrighty, so this is a very complimentary paper, same topic of the Ketanji Brown-Jackson hearings. I first wanted to concentrate on the racial and gender makeup of the Supreme Court over time. I looked in particular at the female justices, black justices, and women of color. One other woman of color. The senators, Democratic senators, such as Senator Leahy and Senator Booker, brought up these statistics that there's been 116 justices and 108 have been white men. They were careful not to disparage white men too much. They said, not to undo the progress they have done, but they said it in a much more uplifting way of, this is, progress for our country. It's going to look more like our country to have these people. So the first female justice nominated to the Supreme Court was Sandra Day O'Connor, nominated by a Republican, Reagan. This was an interesting case. Reagan had gotten some flack for being against the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. And then shortly after, he pledged to name a woman to, quote, one of the first Supreme Court vacancies in his administration. When pressed, was this something to do with the ERA? He said, no, denied that, and just said, that it was time for a woman to serve on the court. When she was appointed, conservatives did actually criticize the appointment of O'Connor. They did not believe she opposed abortion enough. They doubted her commitment to making abortion illegal and criticized her support of the Equal Rights Amendment as well. So these debates around various gender and racial issues have existed for a long time. We then had Ruth Bader Ginsburg, nominated by a Democrat, Clinton, Sonia Sotomayor, who I look at more carefully since she's also a woman of color, a Hispanic woman, the first Hispanic woman. And she was nominated by Obama, a black man, which also came with some racial implications. Elena Kagan, also nominated by Obama. Amy Coney Barrett, which was interesting, replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, nominated by Trump in his last hours. And then Ketanji Brown-Jackson, of course, nominated by Joe Biden. Black justices, the first Thurgood Marshall, nominated by Lyndon Johnson at a very interesting time in our history where racial appeals were more overt. The senators and Democratic senators, the same party as Johnson, were known for being segregationists. Clarence Thomas, who I will talk about a little bit, but I excluded him mostly from my analysis because he had issues dealing with women with credible accusations of sexual misconduct. But race was brought up a lot with him, although it was interesting how the Republicans framed it versus Democrats. Republicans saying that George H.W. Bush saying that he nominated the most qualified person, and this was one thing that Ted Cruz hit back against the Ketanji Brown Jackson nomination, saying that Biden saying he was going to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court instead of the most qualified person regardless. There's a real kind of wording of this is the most qualified when Republicans are speaking versus when Democrats are speaking. They'll talk more about, here is some advancement going forward. And then, so I look of the black justices more at Thurgood Marshall because of all the complicating factors of Clarence Thomas, but it is interesting that as much as Republicans try to get away from race, he did emphasize race. He did use his blackness to his advantage in his hearings, calling the Anita Blake accusations high-tech lynching. He also emphasized his background of growing up poor and black in the South. And it was arranged for a group of poor and black Thomas supporters to travel from Georgia to DC. It was paid for, but it was made to look like it was spontaneous, that they were just coming to support him. And then Sonia Sotomayor, I'll get to in a minute, but she got some pressure back on speaking about race and its role in judging. All right. So discrimination over time. So this is something interesting where we see the Thurgood Marshall hearings, and we like to think of racial progress as kind of straight line, same with gender process, but it has not been. It has stagnated. So from a recent Bob Putnam book, income by race converged at the greatest rate between 1940 and 1970. However, as of 2018, black-white income disparities were almost exactly the same as they were in 1968, 50 years earlier. Even taking into account the emergence of the black middle class, black Americans on the whole have experienced flat or downward mobility in recent decades. So on average, Americans have become healthier and wealthier over the past 125 years. There was a blip during the Great Depression, but then World War II kind of rectified that, had a boom in the economy. And during this time, people started buying larger houses, having cars. Cars became ubiquitous, especially here in Indiana. And higher life expectancy, lower infant mortality. And African American incomes rose also relative to white incomes for about 60% of the century, and then levels converged at the greatest rate from 1940 to 1970. But then labor force participation among African Americans declined, and incarceration rates for young black men have increased dramatically. So between 1970 and 2010, no relative economic progress for black men. It stagnated, and black homeownership increased from 1930 to 1970, in part due to the Great Migration, where black people from the South moved up north and were able to buy houses from white people who had moved to the suburbs at this point. And all of this is just to tie back to why the Thurgood Marshall hearings are still relevant today, and how we're seeing kind of a regression back to that kind of 60s, 70s time. Another big, movement that made race more salient was the Tea Party. It re-energized the GOP in 2010, so this was during the midterm election after Obama was first elected. It didn't have, well, there was some overt racism, but a lot of it was more subtle. They attacked Obama. They attacked liberalism. There were code words such as, you're not my hard work. You're not entitled to my hard work. You don't deserve these entitlements. So it combined conservatism and racism. And according to Haney Lopez, it was wholly a creature of white ring dog whistle politics. They also had problems with undocumented immigrants, Arab Muslims, and just the idea of welfare, which is racially coded. Alrighty, so I want to talk about the Thurgood Marshall nomination, and we do not have video from this time, but I did want to highlight some of the quotes that were said to Thurgood Marshall, as well as kind of showing how Marshall responded. It's interesting to see how over time the Supreme Court went from nominees not really replying at all, just being as neutral as possible in their responses, and Marshall actually engaging and not getting angry at all. So Senator McClellan asked, first, I would ask you if you do not agree with me that the mounting incidence of crime in this nation has reached a critical stage. Judge Marshall, I agree with you absolutely. Senator McClellan, do you regard it as having reached proportions where it endangers or jeopardizes the internal security of our country? So here you get Southern Democrats, segregationists, pressing on crime, drawing it distinctly into racial terms. We've had a history of African Americans being tied to crime, going back to various laws like pig laws that explicitly criminalize Black people, and then they could be painted as criminals. Other senators, including Senator James Eastland, a Southern Democrat from Mississippi and plantation owner who often spoke of Black people as, quote, an inferior race. He asked Thurgood Marshall, are you prejudiced against white people in the South? Making things very explicit in these Marshall hearings. However, Marshall was confirmed with a pretty large majority. He lost a lot of Southern Democratic votes, but it was a less contentious vote than the ones we have now. Alrighty. So I wanted to move on to the discussion of gender between nominees. I'm gonna grab my water. So Sonia Sotomayor got some flack for this quote about being a wise Latina woman. However, she was responding specifically to a Sandra Day O'Connor vote. When Sandra Day O'Connor was asked, how would you judge differently as a woman, and being nominated by a Republican, already getting controversy from conservatives, she said, asking whether women attorneys speak with a different voice than men do is a question that is both dangerous and unanswerable. Here she's really pushing back against the idea of gender differences, whereas Sonia Sotomayor, in a quote that was ill-advised, said, I would hope that a wise Latina woman with the richness of her experiences would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life. So this got a lot of attention amongst Republicans. However, we didn't see as much, these mentions of race didn't turn into direct attacks as much as we saw with Ketanji Brown Jackson. Her judgments in past criminal cases, they mentioned briefly that she had ruled on child pornography cases, but did not get into the nitty-gritty of that. She didn't get criticized for her previous criminal decisions. Alrighty. So to look at kind of the other side, because I am focusing more on Republicans questioning Democratic judicial nominees, and I don't have a video more because I don't trust it to actually play than any time constraints. But Cory Booker questioning Judge Amy Coney Barrett. He said, "My colleagues and I on both sides the aisle are worked on criminal justice reform and discussed a lot of them. Some of those I discussed yesterday were example of federal prosecutors who are more likely to charge black defendants who carry offenses that carry harsh mandatory minimum sentences." This was copied directly from the transcript. And sentencing enhancements as a significantly higher rate than white defendants, which on average added 10 years to their sentence, a significant surrender or seizing of liberty. And you said you were not familiar with that particular study. So here you see the Democrats coming from the other side, not saying this is a disproportionate, that, you're ruling in favor of criminals, but more, the criminal justice system has different rules for black and white. Let me see if no thanks. All right, here is the quote. Sorry.
Human decency and human dignity. I'm sorry that we can't have a simple affirmation of what I think most Americans would agree on.
So I just wanted to show a bit of how his affect was. It's not this loud boisterousness. It's not as much trying to get cable TV to bring it on. Just stay kind of calm. You should be keeping this in consideration. So again, I looked mostly at the Republican members of the committee. At first, I was looking at were they elected after Trump, but there were some kind of issues with that. So for example, Lindsey Graham, he at first, when Trump was first nominated, came out pretty strongly against Trump, saying, if the Republican party nominates Trump, we'll be destroyed and we deserve it, to really warming up to Trump and saying, the Republican party is better with Trump. So various senators such as Lindsey Graham, as well as Ted Cruz, they early on did not support Trump as much. At the Republican National Committee, Ted Cruz didn't say vote for Trump, he said vote your conscience, which led to various issues. He thought his career was destroyed at that point and then turned more towards Trump support. So there were some kind of mix-ups. However, the ones that Blackburn and Hawley had the kind of most extreme rhetoric when questioning Ketanji Brown Jackson. Some with the least kind of charged rhetoric was Chuck Grassley. Not that he did not question various parts about her record, wasn't tough about it, but it was not with these kind of buzzwords going forward. All right. Okay. So talking a bit about the critical race and gender theory, this is something that was brought up from the news, as the other presentation talked about. In particular, one person in this conservative activist, Christopher Rufo, brought this up. According to I searched in the New York Times, Washington Post, as well as the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal, the only mention of Rufo was an actual column he wrote. So according to the New York Times, Mr. Rufo is the conservative activist who probably more than any other person made critical race theory a rallying cry on the right, who has become to some on the left an agitator of intolerance. Rufo thought that he could detect the seed of their ideas in a radical, often explicitly Marxist, critical theory text from the generation of 1968. Crenshaw, talking about Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the kind of creator of this critical race theory. She said that this was a selective, quote, red baiting account of critical race theory's origins, which overlooked less divisive influences such as Martin Luther King Jr. So critical race theory, he did say this is a communist kind of theory. It's Marxist, really kind of hitting on making this sound very extreme. And he got this from looking at various books. So like, as Ted Cruz will mention later, Stamped by Ibram Kendi, he looked at the citations in these books, and then from those got to critical race theory, and went backwards. He also has talked a lot about gender, and he's found that that's been even more successful. So I looked at some of his articles that he has written, and this is a word cloud. So of course, a lot of race theory, gender, students, teachers, parents, again, focusing it from the idea of, this is harming children, alluding to the idea of this is grooming children, going into QAnon and Pizzagate conspiracies. Also had a lot of criticisms of Disney, various terms. Alrighty. So QAnon's influence, those who actually believe in QAnon, a very narrow group of people. So 47% of adults have heard of QAnon, most of them very negative. However, 71% stated they consume news on child abuse and sex trafficking. So it's difficult to say how many of these people were hearing legitimate news stories, or were these stories more picked up because of the interest from QAnon. But it has had an influence on political talking points. Okay. So racial appeals, I wanted to talk about the difference between explicit and implicit racial appeals. So explicit will use words such as blacks, race, or racial to express anti-black sentiment. Here, when looking at these hearings, I believe I adapt this to critical race theory being more explicit. However, implicit appeals allude more to stereotypes. As I mentioned previously, talk about crime. That's been, since the 60s, that has been a big term. Same with welfare. That will kind of bring up a stereotype without actually explicitly stating race. Emotional cues are another big thing. Perceived threat is a powerful political motivator. When it's successfully framed as a collective threat, the threat can overcome collective action barriers and cause people to participate in a conflict. Threat perception can also activate a predisposition to authoritarianism and affect the ability of people consuming media to interpret factual information. If you bring up threat, they may be less likely to interpret, is this true or not? So I look at appeals from Brader, taking fear appeals as the attempt to awaken or elicit anxieties of those watching the hearings. Anger appeals, attempting to elicit anger, contempt, or disgust. So as they brought up various crimes such as child pornography cases, this was very much trying to bring up contempt or disgust. Also, we did see with Democrats enthusiasm appeals, talking about how Ketanji Brown Jackson was the first Black woman nominated to Supreme Court, how she was an inspiration to others. Alrighty. So I did want to talk briefly about the critical race theory and gender theory in the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings. We saw in the previous, some of the quotes from Marsha Blackburn. From Ted Cruz, we got quotes that, do you agree with this book? So he's showing, and this also is showing kind of the use of imagery, do you agree with this book that is being taught to kids that babies are racist? And you can see in the book a baby showing a thing that says race. This was a misinterpretation, generously, saying of the actual book that said that even babies can, absorb negative emotions about race. And then he says, for another book stamped by Ibram Kendi, it asks the question, can we send white people back to Europe? That's what's being given to 8 and 9-year-olds. And this is, again, taken out of context. The actual quote was talking about how some abolitionists were saying, oh, we should send slaves back to Africa, saying that they did not have a culture there, and said it would be akin to saying we should send white people back to Europe. So it was not endorsing that idea. Marsha Blackburn, she said, she talked about the 1619 Project, which again, not actually critical race theory, but through Christopher Rufo, Fox News, etc., went back and saw the sources and kind of tied it to it. And she just mentioned it briefly, but she asked, is it your personal hidden agenda to incorporate critical race theory into the legal system? Other misleading information included Senator Lindsey Graham talking about recidivism rates of detainees at Guantanamo. He used a figure 30% as though it were fact when it was suspected recidivism rates. So I wanted to look in depth at just Josh Hawley, the senator who talked the most about crime in terms of child pornography. So I have the frequency of certain terms, case, and I wanted to draw attention to what the phrases were. They said these cases, of course there were these cases, criminal cases, but he did talk about the 7 cases, very serious cases, child pornography case, an unusual case, the Hawkins case, talking about specific child pornography cases. And he stated that Ketanji Brown Jackson had given lenient sentences, again, misleading in that her sentences were not different from various others, that in general the sentences were written when things were mentioned. All right. So in the interest of time, I just want to show child, how many frequencies that was, 64. Almost all of these talking about child pornography, child porn, child sexual assault. Again, trying to elicit disgust. And guidelines, 57, talking about how she did not go along with the guidelines, although again, that is the norm. Alrighty, so just to conclude briefly, because I'm running out of time, by relying on emotions, Republicans are tapping into this psyche. They're not trying for logical arguments, so even when they're fact-checked, it's not going to be as effective. African Americans, along with liberals in general, are portrayed as extremely threatening to the welfare of children. There's also some anti-Semitic tropes in there. And attempting to fight these remarks with, again, fact-checking and logic will not elicit the same emotional response. All right, that is it. Thank you.
Are there questions from the audience about either presentation or connections? Yeah, come on, Stephen. You did a great job, so we want you up here too. We want you on camera. Yes, Dr. Brown.
I just had one small thing on the first paper. Standardization is very important. I noticed that on the first chart, you did it on some of the later charts, but Robert Bork was on for 7 days, and Thomas was on for, he had an extended thing, so you need to maybe divide that by hours or something like that to get a standardization in there. That's just a small point.
Sure, yeah, thanks.
Over here.
I was just interested because I've been following it more recently with the now infamous ban, overturning of Roe v. Wade, and just the more hypercritical that the Supreme Court is getting based on, or at least the talk that they're giving based on gay marriage and the right for teens to go through gender affirming care and stuff like that, and that target focus that they're now moving to away from critical race theory, or at least that I've seen less mention of that and now more mention of that. Do you think it's more of a just focused target? Do you think that we're eventually going to have to, like how we now are starting with a Supreme Court, like basically hearings and stuff like that, like vetting people, do you think we're going to have to now start vetting Supreme Court justices based on stances like where they stand on that, what their previous opinions were on that, what their religion could be? Because I know that certain aspects of like where politics and where politicians are going is based on like things like religion, based on like where they grew up, stuff like that. And do you think eventually over time that too will come into question when being vetted for the position of Supreme Court, like based on the research that you've done?
Either way, we can both get.
Both answers is fine. I'd be happy to hear from both people who
Sure.
did the different
So-
sides of it.
So, yeah. Thanks. So I think we will start to see more attention to those issues in Supreme Court confirmation hearings, largely because with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which was a precedent for some of the other expansions of rights, that now that will be a question that was asked and will have to be asked to see where justices stand on those sorts of issues. So I do think we'll see more attention to those issues.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. I think, too, it'll be more can get attention by trying to paint them as extreme one way or the other. And I think it's just going to get more contentious over time.
Yeah. So for the first paper, I would say so. First, I applaud using C-SPAN as a baseline for these media coverage studies. Typically, when I see this, it's normally like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, and there's like a very weak argument that MSNBC and Fox News are on the ideological extremes, and somehow CNN is the baseline. I don't know if that argument makes sense anymore, so I think that using C-SPAN as a baseline for these types of studies makes a ton of sense, and that was great. So specifically with Marsha Blackburn, I couldn't help notice on the graph that she was the only female senator who was kind of picked up on this coverage. So I'm kind of curious about when you have like a female senator asking questions of a female Supreme Court nominee, do you think that helps her in generating Fox News coverage when she's pushing issues like critical race theory? Or do you think that inhibits Marsha Blackburn's ability to get kind of free media?
So that's a good question, and it's not something that we can necessarily clearly answer with the data, since Marsha Blackburn was the only female Republican member of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. So whether gender helps her or not is not something I can answer with data. Certainly when she talks about some of the gendered sorts of language about in the home and things like that, that might resonate well with those making decisions about which clips to show on Fox News. But again, unless we have more female members of the Judiciary Committee, I think that's hard to really tease out.
This is more towards the first paper, like the first presentation. It's more of a comment, just saying about the different levels of coverage and what gets covered. In my education and in my college career, my main focus is more of media and film, and something that I became more aware of while doing my own research with my team was the fact that there is a crew with filming. There is a crew, there is a plan, there is a control and a gatekeep about what gets covered if they stop filming and if they continue with filming. So I did like that you did bring up the different levels of coverage and what gets limited and what can also expand during that time frame as well. So thank you.
Thanks.
This is a question for the whole panel, really. One of the things that struck me about both presentations was the fundamental shift following 2020. And I'm curious to get your views on the impact of George Floyd's murder and its public coverage, and how critical race theory becomes a frame for the Brown Jackson, hearing. So to what extent does George Floyd's murder, or is critical race theory sort of a way for the right to push back against this kind of social momentum toward reform that emerged out of the summer of protest following George Floyd's murder?
So I think it's a very interesting case, because at first you saw with George Floyd, like a lot of these discussions would take place in like white evangelical churches. They'd have like talking to members of the African American community, and then it really got to like painting the protests as very violent, and we saw this with like the January 6th. Getting into my other research, how they said, oh, it was just like these Black Lives Matters protests, where it really became a talking point against kind of even at first the racial justice, and we did see it come up more. I believe that was when, and I'm not sure, that Christopher Rufo started kind of bringing on this, was the George Floyd protest, and I think it was a reaction against it to kind of reframe the narrative.
Yeah, I agree. I do think we see it being talked about as a reaction to George Floyd's death and Black Lives Matter protests, and we also see that on Fox News, the way that they covered Black Lives Matter, the way that they covered all of the protests differed substantially from other networks.
No, I was just going to ask a quick follow-up to the scholar's question. So on the hearing, the gender balance on the hearings in terms of the speaker and the person being questioned, do you think in some ways the fact that a woman asks another woman question, or somebody who's interpreted as being of the same race, allows that person a wider sphere to ask a question that like a man couldn't? Like, you know, Lindsey Graham asking a question versus Marsha Blackburn can have two very different valences. So to what extent does that kind of bust open like the ability to like ask those zinger questions directly?
So I haven't looked at this in depth, but I will say anecdotally, you saw with the like Clarence Thomas hearings questioning Anita Brown, it was pretty much all male. And then they learned from that kind of got a negative reaction. So then when it came time with Christine Blasey Ford, she was questioned by women. And we do see amongst Republican women a kind of different type of feminism, kind of like a mama bear. So Marsha Blackburn came out and she was like, oh, you know, you got a beautiful family and kids. Your mom says that being a parent is her or being a mother is her favorite job. And then she could really kind of dig into things with the veneer of, you know, I've been respectable and also I'm a woman. But that I think, yeah, men had more of a challenge getting across.
Yeah, and then just to follow up on that, I think one way that we might see that with some data is that Josh Hawley and Marsha Blackburn both spent a lot of time on issues of child pornography, and you can see that Marsha Blackburn was clearly rewarded in coverage. Josh Hawley was not.
Thank you.
Well, I have another question if we have time. Okay, great. So I'm a historian, so I'm going to approach this from the historian's lens. To what extent is this discussion in the Supreme Court about critical race theory simply a rehash of the post-Brown angst regarding the dismantlement of segregation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, when you put the word valences, or I can't, I'm not a data scientist, so I'm not quite sure the terms, but when you use you documented which phrases are connected to what. There seemed to be a pretty clear parallel between the subtext of the discussion, which is access and race. And so to what extent do you think that that's a legitimate way of thinking about this current discussion of critical race theory, particularly when you consider how closely related it is in these hearings to phrases like public education, reverse discrimination, or some iteration of that phrasing?
So that's a really great question, and it's hard to fully answer, but I think there is that, historical context that's coming back again. I know I was struck in doing research about previous confirmation hearings and reading about how Thurgood Marshall was treated during his confirmation hearings, and how similar, not the questions, but the tone and the kind of the treatment and the expectation to kind of sit there silently. You could engage some questions, but it was really clear to me that Thurgood Marshall would have had the ability to eviscerate any of those who had asked him questions, and yet he didn't, and he couldn't have. If he had, he probably would not have been confirmed. And the same thing for Ketanji Brown Jackson. She could have easily, I think, blown apart some of these questions about critical race theory, or explained that that is not what critical race theory is, but had she taken that bait, she probably wouldn't have been confirmed. So I do see those parallels.
And of course, the context of the conversation really is about, government influencing children, right? To what extent the federal government and the schools impact children. And of course, that was the segregationist last stand, right? Federal overreach in usurping the rights of parents to control the schools in which children attend, their children attend. It's the same.
Yeah.
Sorry. I thought it was a very interesting conversation.
Yeah.
I guess that's my cue. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific discussion. And I'm sure there's contact information in the program book, so if you have questions, please feel free to contact them and continue the conversation. And thank you for your time this afternoon.